Today we will learn and reflect on the Reconstruction and Jim Crow redemption eras following the Civil War. Southerners were stubborn. Southerners were intransigent. Southerners would never accept St. Paul's declaration that there is neither Jew nor Greek, there is neither slave nor free, there is neither male nor female, for you are all one in Christ Jesus. It was anathema, unthinkable, incomprehensible that Southerners and many Northerners would ever regard Negroes as equal to free white men. In their eyes, Negroes were inferior. They would always be subservient. General Sherman may have burned Atlanta and destroyed livestock and crops and railroads in his march to the sea. General Grant may have continually fought and flanked Robert E. Lee until he was cornered and cut off from supplies at Appomattox. These two Union generals may have momentarily exhausted the ability of the South to continue the war, but the true Civil War to change racial attitudes is a war that's being fought to this very day. Our primary sources will be lecture notes from two Yale University undergraduate class lectures that are available on YouTube. Professor Holloway's African American History class and Professor Blight's Civil War and Reconstruction class. At the end of our talk, we will discuss these sources, and feel free to follow along in the PowerPoint script we uploaded to SlideShare. Please, we welcome interest and questions in the comments. Let us learn and reflect together. Reconstruction is in three phases: Presidential Reconstruction, Radical Reconstruction, and the Redemption or Jim Crow era. In Presidential Reconstruction, under Presidents Lincoln and Johnson, lenient terms enticed the Southern states back into the Union. However, the South overreaches, enacting black codes so harsh that they effectively re-enslaved the free blacks to their former masters, denying blacks any rights as citizens. This totally backfires on the South, because outraged Northern voters strengthen the position of the Radical Republican Congressmen, who gain a veto-proof majority in both houses of Congress and pass legislation to implement Radical Reconstruction. The South is placed under military rule, new civil rights legislation is passed, and policies that benefit free blacks are enforced. The Southern states are forced to approve the Reconstruction amendments that abolish slavery, compel the states to grant citizenship to black freedmen, guarantee due process of law, and grants the right to vote to all citizens, including ex-slaves. But there's mass resistance. The Ku Klux Klan and similar white supremacy groups spring up, terrorizing the South in their night rides and burning crosses. Lynchings become commonplace. The Panic of 1873 causes a deep recession. Northern public opinion tires of the endless struggle against the old Confederacy, leading to the final phase, the Redemption era. Federal troops are withdrawn from the South, and Southerners are free to rule as they see fit. Jim Crow laws are passed, denying blacks their civil liberties and their ability to live a normal life with a decent paying job. The KKK and other night riders step up their lynchings to intimidate blacks, in some cases violently overthrowing legitimately elected local governments. The South also won the War of Historians, the War of Remembrance, the campaign to romanticize the Civil War as the noble lost cause. We were taught in Southern schools that the Civil War was fought over the issue of states' rights, not slavery, that under Reconstruction the South was victimized by Northern carpetbaggers and ignorant blacks who spent their days eating fried chicken. Under the leadership of the United Orders of the Confederacy, the South also won the school textbook wars. The lost cause narrative casts the Civil War as a chivalrous struggle for states' rights, rather than as a struggle to preserve slavery. And this perspective will be revived with the fight against so-called critical race theory. And we have two videos on critical race theory and the lost cause myth. The first video explores the commonly understood definition of critical race theory, concluding that in practice, critical race theory is really the old lost cause myth. The second video is about the controversial book's Beloved in 1619 project. Now, as a preview, I will admit that I'm not a big fan of the book Beloved. You can listen to the video to find out why. The other book reviewed, the 1619 Project, is a collection of personal histories of what it was like to live as an ordinary black American in the Deep South in the Redemption or Jim Crow era after 1874. This video covers the story of a black storekeeper who was murdered in broad daylight with his children watching. An unfortunate consequence of his hard work and success was that a white neighbor and the sheriff thought he had gotten way too uppity. After the funeral, the white neighbors claimed that the family owed them money. They robbed the widow and her children of their land, their house, their money, and all their possessions, with no legal recourse, and drove them out of town. This was not a unique story. Several other similar stories are told of how ambitious blacks were put in their proper place, sometimes 6 feet under. Shortly after Lincoln started his second term as president, Congress passed the bill creating the Freedmen's Bureau. It was never intended to be a permanent agency. This bill had to be renewed several times during Reconstruction. Professor Holloway tells us, the Freedmen's Bureau was social reform by military force. Americans had never done this before. A national, federal, social welfare agency in a land that had lived and breathed laissez-faire government. In a land that had lived and breathed the idea that governments don't provide food for people. People provide food for people, health care and schools. The war forced a new type of history. The initial purpose of the Freedmen's Bureau was to aid refugees and displaced people, black or white. Professor Holloway continues, the needs were great. By late winter 1865, there were at least 250,000 totally displaced, starving white people and also 4 million soon-to-be liberated slaves. The Freedmen's Bureau was to provide all kinds of physical supplies, medical services, schools where it could. Its purpose was also legal, to supervise contracts between freedmen and employers. Many of the reforms by the Freedmen's Bureau were quickly reversed when the white redemptionists took power after Reconstruction. These white redemptionists defunded many of the public schools and public hospitals. The Southern distaste for welfare programs led to the United States being the only developed country that did not develop a national health care system after World War II. During the last year of the war, Lincoln, using his presidential war powers, initiated a lenient program of presidential reconstruction. His primary objective was to shorten the war. A state could be readmitted to the Union if 10% of its citizens swore an oath of loyalty to the Union and abolished slavery. The 13th Amendment was passed by Congress and a majority of the states constitutionally abolishing slavery. Blanket pardons were issued to Confederate soldiers with a rank of lieutenant or below. When Lincoln was assassinated, shortly after the Union victory in the Civil War, his Vice President Andrew Johnson is sworn in as president. Lincoln's assassination may have moved the Civil War from the Southern battlefield to the political battlefield in the White House. Johnson vetoed more legislation than all other previous presidents combined. Nearly all of his vetoes were overridden by the Radical Republicans in Congress. Johnson was eventually impeached. Although he was acquitted by 1 vote, he was subdued for the rest of his term. And we see in the painting Lincoln's wife Mary is pictured in the center, lying across the president's body. And his son Robert stands in the foreground to the right of the bed, and Vice President Andrew Johnson is seated at the far end. He's not standing and talking with the rest of the people, like he's kind of ostracized. Johnson was added to the ticket to appeal to whites in the border states, and also white Unionists in the Confederate states. But Andrew Johnson was a virulent white supremacist and believed in states' rights. Although he hated the Southern planter class since he was from the poor yeoman farmer stock, Johnson was openly racist. He was not anti-slavery. Johnson believed that the United States should remain a white man's country forever. After he became president, Johnson moderated his opinions upon assuming the presidency. In addition to issuing thousands of pardons to ex-Confederates, Johnson restored the abandoned plantations to their original owners. Many blacks had hoped to receive what they thought was promised to them, which was 40 acres and a mule, a small restitution to give them some semblance of economic independence. But this would be an idle hope. Andrew Johnson tried to put in place some so-called Johnson governments in the South. The reason Johnson could get away with this is that Congress went out of session in the summer of 1865, and thus Johnson had largely a free hand to act, and did he ever act. By December of 65, when a new Congress would reconvene in Washington, all the states in the former Confederacy, except for Texas, had met the simplest of criteria, had written new state constitutions, and found that portion who are loyal to form a new government. And these were very tiny proportions in some place. In fact, there were no loyalty oaths. All but one state, Texas, was ready for readmission to the Union, under what Eric Foner calls the amazing leniency of Andrew Johnson. The only major demand put upon them was to formally nullify their act of secession. That's basically all they had to do. Professor Blight continues. These were whites-only governments, formed by former Confederates, and they began to pass what quickly became known as the Black Codes. These Black Codes mirrored the old slave codes. They explicitly denied the right to vote to blacks, the right to serve on juries, the right to hold office, the right to own property. Vagrancy laws and state laws directly obstructing the work of the Freedmen's Bureau were passed. But Congress, controlled by radical Republicans, balks at admitting unrepentant Confederate states represented by many former Confederate officials. Many Northerners wondered why so much Union blood had been shed and so many soldiers' lives had been lost. For what? So the South can re-enslave their former slaves under the Black Codes? The Civil War was fought to emancipate the slaves, not to re-enslave the freemen. Elected Southern congressional representatives were not allowed to take their seats in Congress. Congressional hearings are held with over 100 witnesses, including Robert E. Lee, investigating the status of the black freedmen in the South and the effects of Presidential Reconstruction. And these Reconstruction constitutional amendments are passed. The 13th Amendment abolishes slavery. The 14th Amendment declares that all persons born or naturalized in the U.S. are federal and state citizens, and all citizens have the right to due process and equal protection under the law. And the 15th Amendment declares that no citizen shall be denied the right to vote. The struggle to permit the black freed slaves to vote is critical to preserving all their other constitutional rights. This struggle over voting rights continues to the present day. Eric Foner titles this book on these Reconstruction Amendments, The Second Founding, and it really was the second founding of America. With these civil rights amendments, federal law can supersede state law when the state legislatures do not guarantee the civil rights of their citizens. States no longer have the right to deny their citizens their right to vote or their right to due process. Congress passed the first Civil Rights Act of 1866 to enforce the provisions of these constitutional amendments. All Southern states are required to adopt the principles of these three amendments to be readmitted to the Union. These amendments give the federal government the power to enforce basic civil rights for citizens of the individual states. But later, the Supreme Court restricted the reach of these amendments in the Jim Crow and Redemption era, but the Civil Rights Acts of 1965 and the Warren Supreme Court decisions breathed life back into these amendments, restoring their original intent. President Johnson is deeply unpopular in the North. Most voters think he's catering to the Confederacy. The Radical Republicans win overwhelming majorities in Congress in the 1866 midterm elections. Johnson vetoes most of the Civil Rights and Reconstruction Acts. The Radical Republicans override most of his vetoes, and Andrew Johnson is impeached for his intransigence. He was acquitted by a single vote in the Senate, but caused less trouble for the remainder of his term. This political cartoon in Harper's Weekly shows Andrew Johnson as a monarch in his own mind, as he bids farewell when he leaves office at the end of his term, soon after his impeachment. Now, Johnson was still popular in his home district. He ran for a Senate seat and became the only ex-president to serve in the Senate, but he was not popular in the Senate. Under Radical Reconstruction, each Southern state is forced to adopt a new constitution approved by Congress. The state is divided into 5 military districts, and a small number of federal troops are sent in to enforce the law. When justice was impossible under local and state courts, civil rights cases could be tried in federal court. Blacks are given the right to vote, and despite sometimes violent intimidation by the KKK and similar terrorist bands, most blacks are politically active, and Republican governments are established in all Southern states. There are many blacks who are elected to public office at the local, state, and federal level. Much was accomplished during the short life of Radical Reconstruction from 1866 to 1877. Violent intimidation by the KKK and similar terrorist groups grew during this period, but much progressive legislation was passed. Now we're going to talk about the Colfax Massacre. There was always resistance, often violent resistance, by many in the Deep South to Reconstruction policies. One of the worst incidents of racial violence during Reconstruction was the Colfax Massacre. After a bitterly contested election in Louisiana in late 1872, armed conflict erupted between armed white Democrats and Republican freedmen and state militia in Colfax. Blacks gathered in Colfax for weeks before the spring of 1873, taking over the courthouse in Colfax. They collected lots of weapons. They built trenches all the way around the courthouse. They were ready for battle. And it is battle that they got from a huge mob of disparate paramilitary whites, many of them former Confederate soldiers, member of the Knights of the White Camellia. And what happened on April 14th was indeed a pitched battle. The whites had a cannon and many weapons. The blacks could not hold them off. They fled into the courthouse. The whites captured a black man and forced him, under gunpoint, to take a torch and set the roof on fire, burning down the courthouse. The blacks who were smoked out were executed on the doorsteps of the courthouse. The few who stayed were burned to death, hiding under the floorboards. At least 150 blacks were killed, many of them execution style with shots to the back of their heads. Afterwards, many of their bodies were mutilated. And Professor Blight continues. The first representatives of the Republican Louisiana state government arrived 48 hours after the massacre and recorded the execution and mutilations. They also described many of the bodies being eaten by dogs and turkey vultures. Well, Colfax led to a national sensation. Harper's Weekly and Leslie's Weekly had illustrations of blacks carrying their dead home to bury them. One black woman described dragging her son away from dogs who were eating his body. And it led to a national investigation, resulting in many indictments, but only 3 convictions. And now we'll discuss white supremacy and redemption, and this section is from Professor Holloway's lectures. Now, when Republican governments faded, once the federal troops left, when they faded in the wake of a resurgent Democratic Party, which is a Southern party, this is at the end of Reconstruction, a range of tactics started being developed to guarantee the return of white power. So it's not just that the federal troops left, the governments collapsed. Whites were suddenly in control, and it wasn't that quick and easy. It happened after years of terror and struggle. Crops that were owned and tilled by blacks were destroyed. Blacks' homes, their barns, and other property were destroyed and burned. Very rarely would a white jury convict a white man for a crime committed against a black man, no matter what the crime. Blacks were denied any semblance of justice. They were completely helpless. If blacks tried to exercise their right to vote, and if someone thinks they might be voting Republican, they might encounter someone standing outside brandishing a whip, making it very clear that if I voted for anybody but the Democrat, the whip would be used. So there's a sort of scorched earth policy by citizens, white citizens of the South, to reclaim what was theirs, to get blacks off their land, to destroy their property. And the people doing this dirty work are quite often the members of the local militias, like the Ku Klux Klan. And Professor Holloway continues, during Reconstruction, blacks had a tremendous new amount of voting power. When redemption begins, black voting power is diluted very quickly through a range of tactics. You certainly have people at the polling stations with whips. There was also gerrymandering, the reconfiguration of voting districts to eliminate or mitigate the black vote. Since housing was segregated, if you cut a district in a certain way, you can make sure that you cut out the black voting numbers to make any real change. And during this period, lynchings terrorized blacks. This is also from Professor Holloway's lectures. During the period of the federal occupation of the South, federal military forces put the lid on lynchings. But once the federal troops are gone, during the era of redemption, lynchings are one way the South redeems itself. Between 1882 and 1901, there were more than 100 lynchings a year throughout the nation. Between 1882 and 1968, over 5,000 people died in recorded lynchings. Easily 3/4 of them or more were African Americans. Historians presume the actual numbers of lynchings were much higher, probably 2 or 3 times higher, maybe more. Professor Holloway continues, lynchings were not just about stringing people up. There are many different types of lynchings. Usually someone is captured, they're strung up, and either a chair is kicked out from underneath of them, or a horse run off, and they die by strangulation, by hanging. But you also have festival lynchings that are advertised in the local paper in advance, so that you know that on Saturday night we're lynching Joe Smith in Natchez. Enough time for rail companies to sell excursion tickets, advertised in the papers, so you can have a grotesque festival around this actual moment of murder. And Professor Holloway continues some more. Lynchings could also consist of a black person being nailed to a post or tree and being lit on fire. It might involve being physically assaulted and mutilated while you're conscious, before you're strung up to a post to be burned, or before you're actually strung up by a tree. When the lynching was over, especially for festival lynchings, the abuse to the body wouldn't end. The body might be chopped down and chopped into pieces for souvenirs. Professor Holloway continues. Billie Holiday, the famous black singer, sings this. Southern trees bear strange fruit, blood on the leaves and blood at the root. Black bodies swinging in the southern breeze, strange fruit hanging from the poplar trees. Pastoral scene of the gallant South, the bulging eyes and the twisted mouth. Scent of magnolias, sweet and fresh. Then the sudden smell of burning flesh. Here is fruit for the crows to pluck, for the rain to gather, for the wind to suck, for the sun to rot, for the tree to drop. Here is a strange and bitter crop. And in his lecture, you can actually hear the recording. Professor Holloway continues. Now, I said that lynching is seen by many white Southerners as the answer for rapists, especially black male rapists, and that is the received wisdom. But really, what is it? Ida B. Wells, black woman journalist, an incredibly brave black woman journalist, I might add, becomes an incredible civil rights pioneer, and she's one of the founders of the NAACP. Ida B. Wells lives in Memphis, Tennessee, and of course she hears about the scourge of the black male attacking white womanhood and raping women and children. And then she had a horrible experience. One of her friends, Thomas Moses, opens a store, the People's Grocery. He's a black man competing against a nearby store owned by whites, catering to both white and black customers for the whole town. And Thomas Moses was lynched for opening up his competing store. Professor Holloway continues. Wells writes editorials, organizes a boycott, and then had to flee Memphis to save her life. She would not return to Memphis until the very end of her life. Decades go by. She is convinced she will be killed if she steps back into the city. But Ida B. Wells starts to speak out about lynching publicly. She starts writing consistently in ways that are deemed to be a threat to Southern manhood. When she also claimed that white women often desire the interracial dalliances where they actually did exist, she crossed the final line of taboo that white women might actually desire black men. And Professor Holloway continues about Ida B. Wells. And Ida B. Wells asked, if the South is so against rape, why aren't white men lynched? There is a long history of white slave owners raping their slaves having children. After emancipation, rape knew no color line. She travels to England on a speaking tour, an anti-lynching crusade. And this is where she really becomes a persona non grata in the South. Indeed, white slave owners raping their slaves was very prevalent. Both Frederick Douglass and Booker T. Washington had white master fathers. Neither of them had any relationship with them whatsoever. Professor Holloway continues. Ida B. Wells investigates and reports on many lynchings. She discovers lynchings have nothing to do with allegations of rape, as many whites believed. Accusations of theft, rude behavior, and assault often precede lynchings. Ida B. Wells relates the news of these lynchings to her English audiences, how Southern white men epitomize uncivilized behavior. Some English societies in England start sending investigatory groups to the South, profoundly humiliating Southerners. The South is enraged at Ida B. Wells and her inappropriate behavior. And we have a video on many of the writings of Ida B. Wells, journalist and anti-lynching activist. And we punctuate her stories of lynching with many of her other civil rights essays. In this period, the Ku Klux Klan rules, and Professor Blight tells us the Ku Klux Klan came into its own in 1868. There was a reign of terror in 5 or 6 Southern states in this election, especially in Louisiana, Georgia, Arkansas, and Tennessee. All across the South in 1867, and especially in that election year of 1868, as blacks are becoming tenant farmers and sharecroppers, somehow trying to eke out livings, they went to the polls in extraordinary numbers, risking and often losing their lives at the hands of thugs like the KKK. There were more than 200 political murders in the state of Arkansas alone in this election. The death toll in Georgia was lower, but intimidation at the polls was very effective. In 22 Georgia counties, with a total of 9,300 black men listed on the voting rolls, Grant in 1868 tallied only 87 votes. In Louisiana, more than 1,000 people died in political violence in this one election year, almost all of them black, all between April and November 1868. In 21 Louisiana parishes where 28,000 blacks voted in 1867, only 501 black votes were cast in 1868. The redemption white supremacists totally rejected the Reconstruction and Freedmen Bureau's reforms benefiting all poor people, white and black. White supremacists did not want to provide any social services to their ex-slaves, and if that meant denying them to poor whites, that was acceptable. White supremacists and moderates who tolerated white supremacist talking points, including a majority of Supreme Court justices, managed to neuter the effects of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Civil War constitutional amendments until the 1960s. During the Redemption KKK takeover of the Deep South, many public schools and public hospitals were closed down. Which leads to the question, were blacks worse off or better off in the Jim Crow era than they were under slavery? Economically, many blacks were destitute with few educational opportunities, excluded from voting, mostly ignored by the judicial system, subject to intimidation by white supremacist thugs with no legal recourse. But in one respect, blacks were worse off. Under slavery, they had a significant economic value as a slave to their owner, which meant that their owner would sometimes protect their property. But after slavery, if black freedmen were lynched, no white man suffered any financial loss. So it was not in the financial interest of any white man to protect black men. But the historian Eric Foner notes that in another respect, black freedmen were better off. They rarely worked in gangs on plantations and mostly sharecropped on small plots of land. No longer did they work under the lash of an overseer. Marriages of blacks were legally respected. No longer would their wives and children be ripped from their side to be sold to unknown plantation owners hundreds of miles away. But they might be murdered and their property stolen and driven off their land, and if they complained, they were arrested on trumped-up charges, since often the police participated in these brutalities. Now we'll discuss the sources we use for this video. Jonathan Holloway was a Yale professor whose chosen academic field is Black history, a topic he chose as a teenager. These are his undergraduate lectures on African American histories, and as you can see, the first 6 lectures covered his history through Reconstruction, and the remaining 19 courses cover the history of Jim Crow in the Civil Rights era. And Professor Blight's lectures on the Civil War and Reconstruction era from 1845 to 1877 have a different perspective. He gives us background on Southern culture for the first few lectures, and the following history lectures quickly pick up the pace. He covers many topics more important for American history, like the pre-Civil War history of the Polk administration and the acquisition of Texas and California, and Henry Clay and the Compromise of 1850, and how the Republican Party formed from the ashes of the Whig, Free Labor, and other parties. One of Professor Blight's lectures is on Black Reconstruction, which is a direct reference to the history by W.E.B. Du Bois, who was the first black Ph.D. candidate attending Harvard, and he wrote the history titled Black Reconstruction. W.E.B. Du Bois was a third-generation black leader who co-founded the NAACP and was an activist black leader. But we do not want to forget the foremost second-generation black leader, Booker T. Washington, who feels rather neglected because for every 40 people who watched Mr. Du Bois' video, only one person watches his video. Booker T. Washington founded the Tuskegee Institute and advanced the cause of black education with the help of wealthy white philanthropists like Andrew Carnegie, and he lived during the worst years of the Jim Crow KKK redemptionist era, so he was more accommodating publicly, though privately and secretly he helped fund the NAACP. And we have another video that documents how the Nazi lawyers studied the Jim Crow legal system when drafting the Nuremberg race laws, leading to the persecution of the Jews under Hitler, proving there is a direct link between white supremacy and Nazism. We don't plan on doing a video on book reviews of civil rights and the American history, but we do have a blog on that with links to many of the civil rights books, and this is a blog we'll be updating. The YouTube description includes a link to our PowerPoint script that we uploaded to SlideShare and also our blog. Please support this channel by sharing this video with your friends and by clicking on the like and subscribe buttons and by clicking on the Amazon links to purchase any of the books we discussed, which will earn us a very small affiliate commission. And please consider becoming a patron of our channel. Plus you can click on the Meetup or small M icon to participate in our online discussions, where we practice our future YouTube scripts.
And please click on the links for other videos that will broaden your knowledge and improve your soul.